Hey, just when you thought things couldn't get any more exciting, it is Thursday. That means it's Mortgage Minute with Art Alvarez. Hi, my name is Jeff Harrison, and this is a show about, anything that we talk about with the mortgage is concerned. And we're very fortunate to have such an expert on hand. His name is Art Alvarez. He has over 4 decades in this industry, has seen it all, worked through it all. He has a plan. Let's bring him on. Where is he? There he is. Hey, Art, how you doing?
Hi, Jeff. Good. How are you?
Good. Should we call you the man with the plan?
What happened to King Arthur?
Well, that's right, King Arthur.
That was
Well,
last week, wasn't it?
yeah, it's got it. We got to do something
Last
different.
couple of
But I
weeks.
like. I might stay with that King Arthur thing. I'll figure
Yeah.
something out. I'll play with that a little
Of
bit.
course, I just
So,
read that it turns out the whole King Arthur thing may be fictional.
oh,
King Arthur was not real. So
come on.
yeah, apparently so. There's some raging debate about that, from historians.
Well, please don't tell me Santa's not real. Come on.
Well, I won't tell you that.
Okay, good, good. Hey, speaking of real, you've got some information for us today, and then we've got some questions and answers going on. I'm looking forward to get started. For those of you that join us live during the show, remember, this is a show for you to answer your questions because this is with Mortgage Works. They have the answers and they're on the house. Please put them in the comments and we'll feed them into Art live during the session. And if you're watching us afterwards, put your questions in comments and Art will check back later and make sure you have an answer. With that, Art, I'm going to turn it over to you and we'll see you in a bit.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Welcome, everyone, to this week's Mortgage Minute. As you know, I like to jump into what's going on in the financial and bond markets and in particular interest rates. So let me touch on that quickly. I'm going to go through this a little bit quicker than I usually do. I don't want to get too much in the weeds about economic data points, but there's our current rate grid. It's been updated based on current conditions. We try to do that daily. These are rate indications. The actual rate you'll get is going to be dependent on a multitude of factors. I actually touch on that in the About Mortgage Rates link at the bottom of that grid. You might want to check that out. So this week been an interesting week, a pretty terrible week in terms of international news, as you all know. But that, unfortunately, it does have an effect on the financial markets and what's happening with the bond market. So there you see a grid of the 10-year Treasury note. This is actually for today. We had a pretty big jump up today, although earlier in the week, we actually had a pretty good dip in the 10-year bond yield. At one point, we were under 4.6, about 4.56. And so what's going on there? What were the factors that affected the bond yields and mortgage rates this week? Well, the usual data points, I cover them there, PPI, CPI, and jobless claims. Just touch on those briefly. Yesterday was the PPI. It came out slightly above expectation. The market didn't really react to that. The CPI came out today, again, slightly higher than expected. The markets did react to that. We've had a pretty good jump in bond yields. But on the next bullet point there that you see, flow of funds, I want to touch on that because I haven't touched on that before as it relates to mortgage rates and the bond market. As you all know, the terrible situation in the Mideast and Israel and the events over last weekend. What we saw after Monday was sort of a quiet day in the financial markets because it was an Indigenous Peoples Day, so some of the markets were closed. So going into Tuesday, what we did start to see is a pretty good improvement, a drop in the 10-year bond yield. Because if you remember last week, the 10-year bond was getting up close to 480, 485. We were starting to think 5% was coming. Well, early mid this week, it dropped quite a bit. Again, I mentioned got under 4.6. And the reason for that was what I call flow of funds, because that does have a play that is a factor at times in what's happening with mortgage rates. In this case, it was a bit of what we call flight to safety or a safety trade. In other words, when you have really disruptive international events going on, in this case, what's going on in the Middle East, you will see the financial markets respond where some money will flow out of other investments, most commonly the stock market, and into what they call a safe haven like Treasury bonds. And so that can help drive bond yields down like the 10-year Treasury bond. And that's what we saw, early to mid next week. That did have some beneficial effect on mortgage rates, not as much as you might think, because again, the 10-year Treasury bond is a good barometer, but it's not directly correlated, but it's probably your best benchmark. Mortgage loans are actually backed by bonds too, but those are actual mortgage-backed securities or what they call MBS. So we saw a little bit of improvement in mortgage rates because of the flow of funds or the flight to safety situation with these international events. But much of that's been undone this week with these CPI and PPI numbers that came out. Jobless claims, 209,000, slightly above last month, but not a big market mover. So that's basically where we're at with the financial markets and interest rates. Again, at the bottom of the screen, you'll see there what I say about financial markets. They respond with reptilian-like minds to stimuli. That's why you can see some choppiness in mortgage rates and bond yields from day to day. And on mortgage rates, on rates in general, I would say keep this in perspective, expect higher for longer. So that I want to actually go into, as you know, I commonly will cover a particular news feed that catches my attention. And this happened again this week. I saw an interesting article. I actually saw a couple of versions of this article on the newsfeed page. This one, there's a headline there for one of them. Again, I saw this article essentially being published through a few different sites. Bad news, homeowners. One of these three things needs to happen for house prices to be considered affordable, says a real estate expert. This particular one, Insider Today on October 9th. In another article about this, I actually saw a sentence that I had to put on the slide there. 2022 shocked many of the 40 and under crowd as mortgage rates went from the 3% range to more than 7% in the blink of an eye. Of course, I've seen that process before, but it's right. Folks who are like, say, 25 to 40 years old, their historical, mortgage rate perspective has really been only the last 10 years or so, where we did see some periods like 12, 13, rates did get into like mid high threes, 15, 16, same thing. So what we saw in 2022 was a shock for that, younger prospective homebuyer crowd who had really not seen that before, like I have. Now, this author basically wrote that it'll take one of three things: a 35% correction in home prices, 4% decline in mortgage rates, note that, or a 55% hike in income to normalize the property market. And of course, I put that in italics because I want to comment on that. Now, first of all, in terms of his math, these three different things that need to happen, or one of these things of three things that need to happen, they're all correlated. And what they're correlated to is a 3.25% rate. Again, notice that 4% decline in mortgage rates. So I think this writer was assuming current rates are 7.25, and he's looking for mortgage rates to get back to 3.25 so we can have a normal market. But that's kind of what bugs me about this article, because the premise harkens back to 2020 and 2021. Well, as you know, I've said repeatedly on this program, those couple of years were not a normal market. They were not a normalized market. Why? Well, for one, we had a pandemic, 100-year pandemic. That's not normal, obviously. And what was the reaction to that? The Fed pumped massive amounts of money into the economy, essentially driving rates near zero. And certainly mortgage rates, we all saw, got to be at a very low levels. I made a lot of loans at 2.25%. Many other types of loans stayed in the twos or barely got over 3. So the point I want to make here is that I think this writer is trying to create an expectation that I think is not valid, or is in some sense foolish. I would urge everyone, if you're on the sideline about buying a home, waiting for 3.25 again is probably not a good strategy. I think it's a little bit of a fool's choice, because a normalized market doesn't require a 3.25% rate. Now, of course, we do need to see some adjustments in home prices. We are going to see some decline in mortgage rates at some point, but I would urge everyone some caution to think we're going to get back to 3, or certainly under 3, anytime soon. I think that kind of expectation, or waiting for that to occur, I think is a little bit foolhardy, and I would urge you to reconsider that. As Dave Ramsey says, now is not a bad time to buy a home, but you got to reorient your strategies, what your goals are. You got to make some adjustments in your current debt load. You do need to kind of get some money in the bank, although I don't think as much as Dave Ramsey says. You really need to focus on making those changes so that you can embrace where the current market is and get serious about buying a home, because as many observers are pointing out, even when rates do fall, I don't think you're going to see home prices fall in a dramatic way. And in fact, when they do fall, mortgage rates, that is, I would suggest home prices are going to remain firm and even start to go up. So anyway, I wanted to touch on that. I know I'm maybe being negative, although I think this article was negative because I think it's causing people to just continue to sit on the sidelines and think that now is just not a good time. And I think you really need to rethink that and take advantage of the current market conditions and strategize how to take advantage of them and get in the game. So with that, I'm going to bring Jeff back because I think we have a couple of questions that we've received that we want to touch on.
Well, Art, I first of all, thank you. I wanted to jump in with a thought process, and I'm not going to steal your thunder. I'm actually going to add a little extra question here. I remember reading last week or between last week and this week about, the predictions of when we might see the rates go down. And then I saw your rate chart at the beginning and it talked about the 3-2-1 buy down. And I know that's one of those things that's like a normal tool for you to be able to talk about, but there are a lot of people out there who have no idea what a 3-2-1 buy down is and what that would mean for them. To me, it seems like, wow, they're in the best of both worlds, because I think it was 4.25 in a 3-2-1 buy down. And the prediction is the rates will start to soften and go down again, maybe in the third or fourth quarter next year. Wouldn't that seem like it's a great tool to be, putting into play right now and take advantage of the prices before they start going up?
Well, exactly. It is. And we've touched on it before. And I've said many times that in the real estate markets, home builders understand what you just described, the use of the financial aspect of the home purchase to benefit the buyer and make the purchasing decision a little bit more, amenable, something that's going to be a little bit more satisfactory in terms of the buyer's current financial situation. So on our rate chart, right at the very top, we've got the 3-2-1 buy down. This is a very simple concept. What it basically is you take a current mortgage rate, we'll call it 7.25, as you see on the 30-year fixed line. But with the 3-2-1 buy down, all that is happening is that money is being set aside to subsidize the interest rate and the resulting monthly payment for the first 3 years. So the first year, the interest rate subsidized by 3% to 4.25. The second year is subsidized by 2% to 5.25. The third year is subsidized by 1% to 6.25. And then in the fourth year through the 30th, it is at the note rate of 7.25. This 3-2-1 buy down obviously is not free. It has to be purchased. For 3-2-1 on average, again, it will vary depending on where the rate level is and what the loan amount is. But on average, a 3-2-1 buy down is going to cost about 4.375% of the loan amount. So with that, you say, okay, well, how does that get paid for? Well, it doesn't make sense for the buyer to pay for it, for the borrower, because then you're just using money you have now up front to subsidize your rate in the future. That's not a good financial decision. You do need to use other people's money to do this. And the most obvious thing to do is when you're looking at a home that you want to buy, you really like it, it meets your needs, you need a bigger home, a nicer home, you need more bedrooms, those kind of things. What you have to realize is in the current environment, the buyers have a little bit more leverage. If you see a home you really like, but it's been on the market maybe a couple of weeks, 30 days, 45 days, and it hasn't sold yet, that's a signal that you've got a little bit of room in the price. But don't jump into just a price reduction, which oftentimes can be taking 3 or 5% off the price, and you submit a low price offer and you hope it get accepted. Don't do that. Submit a full price offer, or maybe even slightly above full price, but ask the seller to pay that cost of a 3-2-1 buy down. Mm-hmm. That way, if they agree, that first year you're at 4.25, not 7.25, and depending on the loan amount, and in today's average loan amount, that could be worth $1,000 a month in the mortgage payment the first year. And that 3-year period of that bought down rate is your window to take advantage of what Warren Buffett calls your one-sided bet. You're going to take the loan at the 7.25 note rate, negotiate the 3-2-1 buy down. You're taking a one-sided bet where if you're right, within the next 3 years, mortgage rates are going to fall and you can refinance out of that 7.25 note rate into something that hopefully will be in the 5s, maybe even 4s. So that's basically how it works. Home builders do this all the time. resale markets, we've seen a little bit more use of this, but I still think not as much as we should.
Well, I appreciate that. I just thought, boy, this is a perfect example of discussing this before we jump into today's questions, because I think it is definitely one of those things where you said, you and Dave Ramsey, Dave's a smart guy, you're smarter, that buy your house now, but there are ways to do it versus just asking for a discount. So,
well, one other point about this, if I may, I saw a presentation this morning with current data for the California real estate market, state of California, as well as here in our local market. And an interesting change, last year in many markets and throughout much of the state, last year, the year before, and actually 2 years ago, 80% of listings were selling over list price. Now only, like 20%. So that's a big shift. And again, that's another signal that home prices, while they haven't dropped substantially, they've softened, and that's where it gives you some room to negotiate, this kind of option, this 3-2-1 or 2-1 buy down, get the seller to pay for it. It's a win-win for everybody, I think, and it just, I think, is a little bit underutilized in the resale markets.
Yeah. Remember, do this before you discount the price. Talk to your agent, and if you're not sure, hey, what this all means, the best thing to do is to call Art first at 760-883-5700 and say, hey, I'm looking at a house. What does this mean? How much should I ask for a buy down? You'll help them kind of, if you will, set up the scenario, won't you?
Well, exactly. In fact, what I encourage people to do, either a prospective home buyer or their agent or both, maybe you're looking at a house. Again, you're contemplating an offer and you're thinking, well, we want to offer below list by some amount. I think it would be worthwhile to check with someone like us, like me, or if you have a preferred lender, check with them, but check with somebody and just ask, we're going to take a look at this home for, $600,000 and we're going to offer $575,000. Is there a better approach for me as a buyer, or for my buyer if I'm the agent? Is there a better approach to get that $25,000 in concession? Is there a better approach of trying to get that not in price reduction, but in some other way, using the $600,000 list price, but get those $25,000 and apply it in a different way for the benefit of the buyer financially? And there are, as we just described, some very effective ways to do that I think are very, very powerful and compelling for a buyer to now realize it is a good time to buy if we can pull off this kind of strategy.
Yeah. Great stuff. 760-883-5700. You get a hold of Art. Okay, let's jump into today's question.
Okay.
We've been talking a little bit about, hey, how to mortgage, what are the fees associated with a loan? And then also, how do mortgage brokers get paid? And you talked about that. But really now what I want to know is, why do mortgage rates that are offered vary between brokers and lenders? And what factors influence these rate differences, Art?
Well, a couple things on that. First of all, mortgage rates among lenders, or originators, I call them, can vary, but the variation is relatively narrow. I would say in most cases, you're going to see most any originator you talk to get a quote, you're going to be probably within 0.5% plus or minus. So what goes into that? Why is there that variance? Well, of course, with some originators, I call them, and again, remember, we're talking about commercial banks, credit unions, mortgage banks, and brokers. That's what I consider the four major providers of mortgages. Rate offerings from those different entities they are going to vary a little bit, in part just based on how much of the process that type of originator is involved with, and therefore the resulting overhead that goes with it. I mean, obviously, if you're a commercial bank, we all understand what kind of overhead goes into having a commercial bank situation where you got multiple branches and all the overhead that goes with that. And of course, people and their compensation is a major factor. And of course, a bank can, originate the loan from, initial consumer contact all the way through funding and then being in their loan servicing portfolio. That all speaks to more overhead, and that can affect what kind of pricing you're going to get. And that's similarly true with a credit union or a mortgage bank. A mortgage broker, more specialized, they focus on that direct to consumer contact, process the application, deliver it to a lender who handles all those, what I call backroom operations that have more overhead. And that way, because the mortgage broker is a low-cost provider of that initial critical piece of originating the loan with the consumer directly and then delivering it to the lender, that is a big reason why they are able to offer, and data now shows that on average, you're going to get a better deal from a mortgage broker than you are from these other providers. Again, including the big banks or mortgage banks or credit unions and some of these online, type of lenders. Now, that's not always the case. Obviously, some of these other providers will have good deals at times. Some of the major banks, for example, when you're talking about wealthy clients, they can be very aggressive in pricing for jumbo loans to wealthy clients who put a bunch of money in their bank, that kind of thing. Not any other provider, including us brokers, are going to be able to compete with that to any significant degree. But overall, the cost that is going to be borne by the originator, it's going to flow through to the final rate you're going to be offered. And a big part of that are people and the compensation. So that's why I say when it comes to a broker, there is some variance in part, and I would argue in large part because of how they're paid. Remember that rate grid, that compensation grid I mentioned last week, where as a broker, we have to declare what we want to get paid by a wholesale lender. And there's a pretty wide range, 1% of the loan amount up to 2 3/4. Because we're on the lower end of that, we are going to be much more price competitive to most other brokers, and then certainly price competitive to the other providers, commercial banks, credit unions, and mortgage banks, because we're a low-cost producer. We don't have the overhead that those other providers have. So that's a big reason why you're going to see some variance. Again, it's not that great of a variance, but it's enough that folks like us, low-cost broker, demanding less compensation than most of our competition as brokers from our lenders, that gives us a little bit of an edge in terms of that rate comparison.
That's great information, Art. Thank you so much. And also, if you missed last week, make sure to jump back in and take a look at that, because Art was talking about that compensation grid and how brokers, Art, and somebody down the hallway who's another broker might have a different compensation, and their rates are not the same, even though it may be being originated from the same lender. And so that can certainly have an impact on it as well. Speaking of origination fees versus interest rates, can you clarify the difference between, or the distinction between, origination fees and interest rates, Art, and how they impact the overall cost of a mortgage?
Yeah, that's a good question. And what's interesting about origination fees is there's some historical context to the concept of an origination fee. And then, of course, you also have what you'll hear oftentimes, points. And those two things can be a little bit confusing, but in a lot of ways, they're really one and the same. At least they are now. And what I mean by that is, first of all, historically, an origination fee, that really kind of came to be back again in the 30s when the FHA was created. And at that time, the FHA and the Department of Housing and Urban Development, of course, came out with the concept of mortgage insurance, where lenders were insured against default by the borrower. That allowed for longer term loans up to 30 years, minimal down payments, and so forth. Well, as part of that process of getting that in place, for many years, FHA and VA loans in particular were administered rates, meaning the feds, the Veterans Department or FHA, HUD, would dictate what the mortgage rate would be for a FHA or VA loan. And depending on what those agencies dictated, if the market demanded a higher yield than what FHA would allow, that would trigger points being charged on the loan, because the FHA rate that was allowed was below what investors demanded. So you ended up having a discount or pay discount points in order to get that loan made. But during that period, the process of originating the loan with the consumer, processing it, and getting it into underwriting and funding, that was a specialized segment of the process. And the originator would generally just get a flat fee of 1% of the loan amount. And that's where 1% origination fee came from. Now, in more recent years, mortgage FHA, VA rates are not administered by the government. They're in the free market. In fact, all mortgage rates are. And so now what happens is You may or may not have an origination fee, which is defined as usually 1% of the loan amount, or discount points, which are also, each discount point is 1% of the loan amount. You may or may not have those involved in your particular loan scenario, depending on originator compensation, as I mentioned, and whether or not you just desire a rate that's below market. So the first thing to know is, as we mentioned before, if you're working with a originator who's wanting less lender paid comp, you're going to get a lower 0-point rate than if you are dealing with a broker who wants a higher lender paid comp. And that range can be anywhere from 1/8 to 0.5%. In addition to that, if you're going to have points generated for the loan that you want, that could either be because the rate you want will not fully absorb the originator's compensation because they're demanding a higher amount, like 2 or 2.5% of their loan amount. Or even if it does, maybe you want a rate that's lower than that. And because of the fact that the originator's compensation is higher than, say, us, and the fact that you want a rate that's even lower than that 0-point rate you're going to get from that broker, that's going to create discount points that you'll end up having to pay or get the seller to pay in order to get your loan closed. So that's really kind of the way to think about it today, really, is origination fee, points. Think of them as the same thing. They're at 1% of the loan amount. And whether or not you're going to pay them is going to be a combination of what your originator is getting paid and or whether or not you want to get a lower rate than that 0-point rate that's going to result from what that originator is getting paid, if that makes sense. Jeff?
So really then, if I were out shopping and I'm looking at the rates and I see, your rate, and then I see somebody else's rate and it is higher, I can probably attribute that to their compensation. And then, it's like all costs. They're going to, somebody's got to pay the piper. And so really now there is an origination cost, if you will, for me as the borrower, and I'm really paying for the cost of that compensation. Is that true?
That's basically true. See, this goes back to, remember last week we were talking about what happened, or how was originator compensation handled before the current scheme that was created by the CFPB before 2010. And you remember I said we'd get basically a raw rate sheet, and we could negotiate deal by deal with the borrower. And in those days, we could pick a rate where we would get what's called a lender rebate back to us. In other words, if the current market's 7.25, and that would be at a price of 100, so there's no discount points. But we try to negotiate a higher rate to the borrower of, say, 7.5, and that might create a 1-point rebate back to us, the originator. But in those days, we could do that and then still charge a 1% origination fee to the borrower, so that we were making origination collected from the borrower, 1% net lender credit, it would be called, from the lender. We're making 2% on the loan. That's not allowed anymore. Those days are gone. So now what happens is, I can't, pick a rate or negotiate a rate or offer a rate to the borrower where we're going to get a net lender credit to us and then still charge them 1% as well. We can't do that. We either have to get paid by the lender or we have to get paid by the borrower. And in most cases, it's going to be lender paid. And so if you end up getting a rate where it's not at 0 points compared to
We may have lost Art there for just a minute, but it reminds me of chips and salsa. There is no more double dipping. It is just one or the other, not both. And most of that is going to be lender compensation back to the originator, or excuse me, in this case, the broker. So we'll see if Art comes back online here. We have a couple of segments left. We want to talk about, I'm just going to remove that for a second. Today we're talking about lender compensation. We're talking about, hey, why are rates different? And also, what's the difference between origination fee versus interest rate? I see Art has left the green room. He's probably just going to log back in. I'll bring him in as soon as he gets there, and we'll keep going. The big thing is to remember that Art has been doing this for over 40 years. He has seen the ups and downs. He told stories on previous episodes where the interest rate was 17%. People are still buying houses. They're still buying houses today. They're just doing it differently. One of the biggest things we talked about today was the fact that you can actually buy a home, take advantage of a lower interest rate, but it's using a product called 3-2-1 buy down or a buy down. And what that's allowing you to do is to lock in a rate right now for the first year it's lower, the next year it's 1% higher, and the next year it's 1% higher, and then the fourth year you go to your normal stuff. Well, the reason you do that, obviously, as Art has explained, is you are taking advantage of prices right now on a home, taking advantage of the lower interest rate using this particular product called a 3-2-1 buy down. It was 4.25% on his website. And then in that period of time between, you'll say, opening the loan and going to zero, in other words, back to the regular rate, then what happens is it allows you to find possibly another rate. The rates go down. Let's bring Art back in. Hey, Art. Sorry, I was dancing by myself, and I still stepped on my toe.
Yeah, sorry about that. I think I lost my connection there. So
that's okay. I was just reemphasizing how important that 3-2-1 buy down was and whatnot. But I think that helps clear us up as far as origination fees, interest rates, and also rate variability. It just comes down, as I was saying, when you got locked up, I said, the difference now versus before 2010 is just like when you have chips and salsa, there is no double dipping. You have to take one or the other. You can't take both.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, good news for the consumer. Those days are behind us. It's changed a little bit for the brokers, but it's a good thing. Art, I'm going to turn it back over to you, and we'll keep going.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I just want to finish up with a couple last things. Last week's closing question. This is one of the most controversial questions, I think, in the mortgage business, particularly as it relates to us originators and real estate agents and so forth. What's the difference between a pre-qualification and a pre-approval? In other words, what's the difference between being pre-qualified and being pre-approved? Now, first of all, I'll tell you, some of this is just semantics. It's just variations on essentially the process of someone like us rendering an opinion to others, either the borrower themselves or other third parties, most commonly a real estate agent or maybe a home builder. Can this person qualify for the loan that is reflected in the terms they're offering? So let me dig into that a little bit and try to clear up some confusion. A pre-qualification, I would argue, that's probably the lightest methodology for declaring a borrower is approved or qualified, I should say, or not. It's essentially a mortgage originator opinion. That's all it is. It is usually put in writing in some sort of pre-qualification letter, or we'll call it a pre-qual letter. But understand that it's relying mostly on the expertise and experience of the originator who prepared the letter. Some of us are more experienced and more skilled than others at making the determination if a borrower is approved or not. And unfortunately, there's lots of stories of agents, real estate agents, or home builders getting a letter saying this person's pre-qualified. And then once they get into the loan process, you find out they can't get approved. So that means whatever originator wrote that letter, that opinion, either didn't know what they were doing or made some mistakes and ultimately failed in what they were representing. And part of the problem, too, is there's a lack of standard in our standard format for these type of letters. All of us have a different format. My loan processing system has a particular format that's hard-coded into the system that we basically have to use. Now, a pre-approval, I call it a beefed-up mortgage originator opinion. It's, again, relying on that mortgage originator, their experience, their expertise. But in addition, what it will involve is taking the data, the information we get from a borrower, and running it through an AUS system. It's called AUS because it's automated underwriting system. Fannie Mae has one called DU, that's Desktop Underwriter. Freddie Mac has one called Loan Prospect Advisor. These are pretty similar programs. You put in all the borrower's data that's been collected, it will give us an approval recommendation or not. And so a lot of times a pre-approval will be considered, we'll still issue a pre-qualification or pre-approval letter, but beef it up with these AUS findings, either DU, Fannie Mae, LPA, Freddie Mac. Now, what this really brings to the forefront, I believe, is something that, again, has been readily available for a long time, I think is underutilized, is what we call TBD underwriting. It is possible if you're looking to buy a home, and maybe you're going to take some time, but you want to be sure you're qualified. You can go an extra step. We can take an application from you. We can put your application together, get all the documentation, package it up, register it with a lender, submit it for formal underwriting. Part of that process will be to get those AUS findings and have it formally underwritten, reviewed by the lender's underwriting staff, and a conditional written loan approval issued, so you know exactly what your approval entails, what the conditions are, and that way you have a much stronger evidence of pre-qual, because you've had an actual lender review your information and issue a written underwriting approval. This is a very effective tool, particularly if you're in a market where you're competing against cash offers. So I would encourage people who are looking to buy, you're thinking about you want to buy, take this extra step, a little bit more work up front, makes your closing a lot quicker because we've already got your loan file packaged, and we've got the added benefit of an underwriting written approval from a lender who can fund that loan. And in most cases, we can get to that point with nothing more required than getting the appraisal once you get your offer accepted. So I really urge people to keep that in mind if you're looking to buy a home anytime soon. With that, I want to go to our closing question for next week. And this is a question I actually got over the weekend from a past client. And it's a really good question, actually, and why I wanted to put it on here. Can a non-veteran home buyer assume an existing VA loan in a home purchase? So give that some thought. I'll come back to you next week with some information on that. I think you're going to find it interesting. So keep in mind, I will have the answer for you next week, and it will be on the house. Jeff, back to you.
Art, another great show. Sorry for a little technical difficulties, folks, but hey, sometimes that happens. We have the rate increase and Art is there, or a rate decrease, and Art will redo the paperwork to make sure it's accurate.
That's right.
You see on the screen there information on how to get a hold of Art for getting pre-approval or TBD. That's one you want to go with at 760-883-5700, or his cell phone, which again is locked tight in an airtight container when he's doing his laps. 714-612-9035. You can always get a hold of him. Somehow I think he has an earbud in there that's also water resistant. So he could probably do his laps and take your phone call. His website is also available at mwloan.com, where you can always check the grid on there, where it's always up to date. And there's a host of tools on there with calculators. So if you're wondering, hey, how much I have to have down? What is this going to do to my taxes? Those type of calculators are there. Check it out. And of course, you can always get a hold of Art at mwloan.com. Art, before I let you go, I want to ask you next week, you've talked a lot about HELOCs, but I want to ask you about how to use a HELOC to lower my monthly costs and eliminate some debt in other areas where we've seen 50, 60, 70% rate increases. Are you open to that?
I am open to that. That's a very, very good topic to touch on. I mean, there's some definitely very good opportunities, but with the qualifier that you got to be careful about how you approach that.
Absolutely. It has nothing to do with the casinos. That's the good news. It has everything to do with lowering your cost of living. As you know, yes, our inflation is going down a little bit, but it's impacted everyone. The cost of living has gone up. This is a way to bring down your overhead. So, Art, with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you, and we'll see you next week.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for watching and listening to this week's Mortgage Minute. My name is Art Alvarez. I'm with Mortgage Works, where we do have the answers and they're on the house. Looking forward to seeing you next week. Take care. So long.